So I've been meaning to ask, what happened to Phantasy Star? Now, to be fair, I've never really been an avid Phantasy Star player. I play most of my RPGs on Nintendo consoles, but I can't help but wonder, is it my fault or Sega's? See, Sega seems to have neglected one of their most beloved IPs in recent years, and they haven't really been making a comeback. Strangely enough, Phantasy Star is all the rage in Japan. It's just really in North America where we haven't been seeing it get all the representation that it deserves. So why is that? Well, let's find out. Phantasy Star, just like most games created by Sega, was created to rival the IP of a competitor. When Enix created the JRPG grandfather, Dragon Quest, Sega knew that to competitively push the Master System, a JRPG equivalent needed to be developed. Today, we know that when corporate executives get involved in the creative process of developing video games, the results are usually very unimpressive. But for the original Phantasy Star, developers weren't thrown together at random. The creative process of the original Phantasy Star was actually a very crucial moment in Sega's history, because it allowed some key talents in the company to step up to the more important roles. Most notably, these include Kotaro Hayashida, creator of Mario's first rival, Alex Kidd, as well as the famed Yuji Naka, the original creator of Sonic the Hedgehog. Of course, Phantasy Star on the Master System wouldn't be that important unless it influenced the RPG genre in some sort of way. Along with basic JRPG combat, Phantasy Star was one of the first pioneers in story-driven gameplay. To enhance the gameplay experience, Phantasy Star took full advantage of the Master System's graphical superiority to introduce storyboards, detailed battle and character animations, and one of the first female protagonists in gaming. In many ways, Phantasy Star actually influenced the JRPG genre more than Final Fantasy did in 1990, largely because the ideas in Phantasy Star continue to be used in JRPGs today, like Nier Automata and the Tales games. Together with its interesting sci-fi setting, Phantasy Star was looking like a classic, and the developers knew it. It may not have sold well in the States, but Phantasy Star on the Master System was undoubtedly a success. And with every success, you can expect a sequel. Phantasy Stars 2, 3, and 4 all released on the Sega Genesis before its life cycle was over. I don't want to go too in-depth while exploring these games. In fact, I plan to do reviews on them in the future. The mainline Phantasy Stars are some of the most underrated RPGs I've ever played. Seriously, download these games. They are available for extremely low prices on Steam and the eShop. And once you start up, you'll start to realize that some of your favorite JRPGs were actually released on a Sega console. Unfortunately, Phantasy Star 4 was the last true Phantasy Star game. Well, the last true mainline Phantasy Star game to be exact. The Sega Saturn came and went without a Phantasy Star to its name, and by the time the Dreamcast dropped, Sega had prepared a bombshell release that would change the course of Phantasy Star and JRPGs forever. Phantasy Star Online was first released in Japan in December of 2000, to astounding critical acclaim. For 2 episodes or expansions, Phantasy Star Online ran with a solid player base on the Dreamcast, and when the Dreamcast finally died, Phantasy Star wasn't phased. Within a year, both episodes of Phantasy Star Online were ported to the GameCube and Xbox, where they garnered a following for another 3 years. Phantasy Star Online even received a PC version known as Blue Burst, featuring 4 additional areas. Sega eventually pulled the plug on Phantasy Star Online in 2007, but the game's legacy and following were too big to ignore. To this day, gamers are still playing Phantasy Star Online on private servers, and some of my favorite YouTubers are leading members of the Phantasy Star Online community. Regardless, after Phantasy Star Online was officially discontinued, fans were treated to games like Phantasy Star Universe, Phantasy Star Zero, and Phantasy Star Nova that furthered the lore of the universe without offering the same MMORPG experience that Phantasy Star had, for better or for worse, become synonymous with. By now, people began to notice a trend in Sega's development cycles that continue to plague it to this day. Unless they're developing a Sonic game, Sega tends to go through phases of intense focus on a single IP, followed by a drought. There are many examples of this behavior throughout Sega's history. The aforementioned Phantasy Star is a huge perpetrator, but games like Alex Kidd, Shining Force, Golden Axe, and Streets of Rage went through golden ages in the Genesis and Master System days, only to be forgotten in the modern times. But for Phantasy Star, the situation is a little unique. Unlike the other games I mentioned, the Phantasy Star name didn't die. Instead, the innovative single-player experiences that rivaled the likes of Final Fantasy are long gone, but they have been replaced by an equally innovative MMO experience. Phantasy Star hasn't died. To put it more accurately, Phantasy Star went through a huge change. As far as the mainline Phantasy Star games are concerned, it's pretty widely accepted that the series has ended. Phantasy Star 4, according to Sega, wrapped up the space adventure in a satisfactory nature that Sega has no desire to change. Maybe it's better to keep it this way, but there's no doubt that these great RPGs are set to become a simple relic of a bygone era in Sega's rich history. But I refuse to end this video on such a terrible note. The old series might be gone, but there is still one project that I forgot to mention. One that most of you were probably thinking when you clicked on this video. I'm talking about Phantasy Star Online 2. By 2012, Sega apparently took notice of the giant goldmine of fans dedicated to Phantasy Star Online, and they released an all-new MMO in Japan. Reports from Japan showed fans that Phantasy Star Online was truly back in all its glory. Not only was it highly praised in Japanese, but by April of its release year, Sega was already in the process of bringing Phantasy Star Online 2 to the States. Or so we thought. Japan is almost on episode 5 of the colossal MMO, and Sega hasn't given more than a word on the future of the game's Western release. I've never even played the original Phantasy Star Online, and this ongoing crisis is probably one of the most frustrating gaming experiences I've ever had. Almost every year, just like clockwork, I check to see the status of the game's release, and find nothing more than a thread or two of angry fans who desperately want to play the game. Now, if you are dying to play this game, the game has already been translated by fans into English, and although it hasn't been officially released, multiple YouTube tutorials share patches for playing the game in the US by using the Southeast Asian server. But in all honesty, we shouldn't have to experience Phantasy Star Online 2 like how we're doing it right now. Sega needs to understand that one of their favorite franchises is on its last legs. The single-player Genesis masterpieces may be gone, but if Sega doesn't focus on Phantasy Star Online 2 in America, the franchise might leave the North American lexicon entirely. I highly encourage everyone who's watching this video to show their support for Phantasy Star. Tweet at Sonic Team, tweet at Sega, and just really ask, can we have Phantasy Star in North America? After the release of Sonic Mania, we know that Sega can be innovative again. So why not bring that same innovation to the table with Phantasy Star? Thank you all for watching my piece on the history and future of Phantasy Star. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, consider subscribing. Stay tuned, and I'll see you all next time.